This presentation is about humanitarian intervention. So first of all, we should define the word intervention in terms of international law for the first part of the presentation. So in terms of international law, intervention is the term for the use of force by one country or sovereign state in the internal or external affairs of another. In most of the cases, intervention is considered an illegal action, but some interventions may be considered legal in some cases only. Whereas foreign policy usually aims to influence the behavior of other states, thus interfering with their decision-making. However, there's something called persuasive diplomatic interference. It is different than the intervention since it seeks to impose one's will, and here we should mention that non-violent coercion is possible, like for instance economic boycott. It's more coercive than persuasive. Also, non-intervention is related to the rights of sovereignty, and the proof of this was the Article 2.7 that said, "Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the UN to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state." And now we will talk about humanitarian intervention and international law. We call an intervention a humanitarian one if undertaken to prevent or punish genocide, which threatens human rights. Also, it can be a response to humanitarian crises such as famines or massive refugee flows. Before the end of the Cold War, interventions were restricted to protect co-nationals or co-religionists. But during the Cold War, a lot of regimes were guilty for violations of internationally recognized human rights. As the UN General Assembly Resolution, the 2625 put it, no state or group of states has the right to intervene directly or indirectly for any reason whatever in the internal or external affairs of any other state. According to this, the Security Council undertook no humanitarian intervention during the Cold War. And here we can notice that international human rights law has left some implementation of the extensive body of international human rights obligations, with the supervision by international committees of experts, but lacking coercive enforcement powers. So according to this, we must consider the moral and political dimensions of the humanitarian intervention. So the third point in this presentation is about the moral standing of a state. Michael Walzer presents a social contract justification of sovereign states based on self-determination. So self-determination, according to Walzer, is only the right of people to become free by their own efforts if they can. And non-intervention is the principle guaranteeing that their success will not be impeded or their failure prevented by the interference of an alien power. States that systematically violate the human rights of their citizens will violate both their international legal obligations and their moral and legal obligations to their citizens. In grappling with the competing moral demands of human rights and self-determination, he also emphasizes the respect for autonomy. His critics give priority to the universality of the moral claims of the victims of suffering. This dispute reflects competing conceptions of the international community. Also, Walzer's critics give priority to the universal moral community to which all individual human beings belong, without the mediation of states. Walzer, however, focuses on the society of states, the ethical as well political community of sovereign states, which has its own body of ethical norms. Even Walzer accepts a humanitarian intervention in response to the genocidal massacres. In fact, some humanitarian interventions must be morally permissible if the moral standing of the state rests on self-determination, respect for autonomy, or respect for the rights of the citizens. Conversely, even strong cosmopolitans grant some moral standing to at least some states. The second point concerning the moral standing of a state There are 3 points: pluralism, paternalism, and political community. So here Robert Jackson offers the closest thing that we have in the recent literature to a principal blanket denial of the legitimacy of humanitarian intervention, based on the values of normative pluralism and anti-paternalism. We value pluralism not so much for itself, but insofar as it reflects the autonomous choices of a free moral agents. The spread of international human rights values has substantially reduced the range of defensible appeals to the normative pluralism. Unusually severe human rights violations thus may overcome even a strong pluralist presumption against intervention. Pluralism can also be seen as a rejection of paternalism because it denies autonomous agency, but unusually severe human rights violations, such as genocide and slavery, are such profound denials of individual autonomy that even a strong presumption against the paternalism must give way. Human rights violations that shock the moral conscience of mankind conclusively demonstrate that there are no moral bonds between a state and its citizens that demand the respect of the outsiders. One could argue that from a purely moral point of view, this has always been the case. So, what has changed is that in the post Cold War era, such violations, especially genocide, are increasingly seen as offenses, not simply against cosmopolitan moral values, but also against the ethical norms of the society of states. And so now we're going to discuss politics, partisanship, and international order. Even successful purely humanitarian interventions may threaten international order. Humanitarian intervention reintroduces human rights violations and humanitarian crises as a legitimate subjects of violent international conflict. Throughout the Cold War era, both the United States and the Soviet Union appealed to humanitarian concerns and principles such as democracy, largely as masks for geopolitical, economic, and ideological interests. A pattern of superpower anti-humanitarian intervention in places such as Guatemala, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Nicaragua was well established. Therefore, both during the Cold War and in the immediate post-Cold War years, the writer argued strongly against the humanitarian exception to the principle of non-intervention. There was a clear international normative consensus across the first, second, and the third worlds. The humanitarian intervention was legally prohibited, and truly humanitarian intervention was politically unlikely not only because of likely veto on the Security Council, but because neither superpower had much of an inclination to intervene for reasons that were centrally, let alone primarily, humanitarian. Today, however, the international environment does not suggest such a blanket rejection. So, the fifth point is about changing conceptions of security and sovereignty. The classic referent of security in international relations is national or state security, defined first by the military and second in economic terms. Thus understood, there is no necessary or even obvious connection between the security and human rights. In fact, ruling regimes have frequently viewed national security and human rights as competing concerns. Consider, for example, the national security states of Latin America in the 1970s, the state of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War, and the United States during the McCarthy era. This began to change with the 1975 Helsinki Final Act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. Human rights were not merely addressed in a major security agreement between the superpowers. They were treated as a security issue. Although the central concern for national security was not supplanted, it was supplemented by a conception of personal security. In a series of CSCE follow-up conferences, Western states emphasized the security of individuals and drew attention to the threats to that security, defined in terms of internationally recognized human rights posed by Soviet bloc states. In the 1990s, talk of human security became all the rage. Other than public shaming, foreign states had no direct role in implementing human rights. Challenges to a strict legal positivist conception of sovereignty emerged from a more general diffusion of human rights values. At minimum, states are required to control their territory and be willing to participate in the system of international law. Although they remain sovereign, their aggression authorizes international action that infringes their territorial integrity and political independence. Genocide has come to be seen as an offense against international society, not just those directly attacked. The Kosovo intervention, along with Bosnia, East Timor, the strong international reaction against inaction in Rwanda, and the considerable international response to the Sudanese depredations in Darfur suggest that much of international community, including some leading power, is no longer willing to accept continued national authority for implementing the internationally recognized human right to protection against genocide. Law and politics seem to be converging toward the moral view that genocide can be tolerated by neither civilized states nor international security society. So it's very important to shed a light on justifying the anti-genocide norm. The 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. But here the writer used another term for genocide, another definition. However, in a looser sense, to refer to any killing of large numbers of people in a particular place in a short time. Although international law and many national legal systems provide greater protection against racial and ethnic discrimination than against political discrimination, the trend in recent discussions seems to be toward treating mass killing as mass killing, whatever the reason or modality. The moral case of intervention against genocide is relatively unproblematic. The nature of the crime even allows us to use an overlapping consensus argument to circumvent the notorious inadequacy of competing moral theories. If all human rights are interdependent and indivisible, and human rights are about a life of dignity, not mere life, then acting forcefully only against genocide is highly problematic. So we can't talk about humanitarian intervention without referring to the changes in the legal practices. So, for example, Nuremberg set a precedent for international judicial action, not for armed intervention. In addition, an emerging body of state practice supports an argument for the existence of international legal right of humanitarian intervention. Debate in the legal literature thus increasingly addresses not whether humanitarian intervention is ever legally permissible, but who has a right to intervene against genocide. Collective humanitarian intervention, one undertaken or authorized by the US, this may have been a considerable exaggeration at that time, before the politically decisive 1999 interventions in Kosovo and East Timor. If we are to confront seriously the problems posed by the humanitarian intervention, we must weigh the full range of competing norms and claims against one another. The justification of humanitarian intervention needs to be much more subtle and complex than it often has been presented to be, especially in the legal and moral literatures. Consider Kosovo. Having learned the lesson of Rwanda, NATO neither waited until the bodies were piled high nor was deterred by the lack of Security Council authorization. The response was outrage in some circles and substantial unease even among many who accepted the intervention as justified. The tension was even clearer in the conclusion of the Independent International Commission on Kosovo that the NATO intervention was illegal but legitimate. So now we came to a very important thing concerning humanitarian intervention, which is justifying a humanitarian intervention. The justification of humanitarian intervention is, given the multiplicity of standards and the controversies over legal and political standards, an extremely complicated matter. A humanitarian intervention might be held to be justified only if authorized in the sense that it meets the demands of all relevant standards. The force of the moral principle of self determination and the legal principle of sovereignty give such a stringent conception considerable appeal. There are, however, other important and relevant senses of justification. For example, contested justifications arise when different standards point in different directions. So there are two types of contested interventions. Some interventions are clearly prohibited but nonetheless excusable. Like, for example, stealing food to feed one's family is clearly illegal, but we are disinclined to say that it's simply, or perhaps even all things considered, unjustified. Even in a court of law, the moral obligation to one's family may carry considerable weight, especially at the time of sentencing. If excusable interventions intentionally produce desirable outcomes, tolerable interventions produce good results largely unintentionally. An excusable act reflects an underlying norm with which we have considerable sympathy. The principle underlying a merely tolerable act, however, cannot be widely endorsed. The positive humanitarian consequences are largely a fortunate accident. There is no simple mechanical means for resolving the competing moral, legal, and political considerations raised by most humanitarian interventions. So another major point we should talk about also is the mixed motives and consistency. A different kind of conflict of standards arises when interveners have mixed motives. Any suggestion that such economic and political interests invalidate humanitarian motives and render an intervention unjustified, however, reflects an absurd moral perfectionism that is dubious even in individual action, and is certainly misguided when applied to states. The presence, even centrality, of non-humanitarian motives, however, does not necessarily reduce its justifiability. Faced with multiple conflicting standards, the very notion of consistency becomes problematic. A state that supports genocide when committed by friends but intervenes against it when committed by an enemy may merit disdain, but for the inconsistency. Such behavior shows great political consistency and consistent lack of central humanitarian motivation. The writer argued, by contrast, for an appreciation of the complex of unconditional interaction of often competing moral, legal, and political considerations. We may, all things considered, have good reasons to give priority to concerns of legality or moral purity, but simply answers to the question, is this humanitarian intervention justified? Rarely are good answers, at least where there are either genuine humanitarian motives or significant humanitarian consequences. Another point, politics and the authority to intervene. Main point that we're going to discuss also. So the problem of the authority to intervene can also be reformulated in terms of competing standards of evaluation. The UN Security Council has the legal authority to intervene, but has been and is likely to remain extremely reluctant to exercise it. Other actors, such as NATO and Kosovo, may have the will and capabilities to intervene, but they lack the legal authority. Great powers acting alone have historically engaged in many more anti-humanitarian than humanitarian interventions. Therefore, multilateral rather than unilateral intervention is on its face to be preferred. Nevertheless, unilateral state power may save lives that would be lost while waiting for a more pure multilateral intervention that never comes. Where intervention rests almost entirely on selfish national interests, with a little broader support among other states or in the target country, the authority of intervening state is much like that of the highwayman. we must deal with purported humanitarian interventions case by case, as they arise, being especially wary of treating them as precedents. Developing a doctrine of humanitarian intervention without Security Council authorization, whatever its moral attractions, seems to be profoundly unwise. We should take seriously, but not too seriously, the illegality of humanitarian intervention not authorized by the Security Council. So, to apply all the points we were talking about during this presentation, we're going to take Kosovo now as an example, and as it's written in the book, Judging the Kosovo Intervention. With all of these considerations in mind, let us return to the case of Kosovo. To sharpen the argument, let us give the NATO decision to intervene the most favorable possible interpretation. In particular, let's agree that genocide was either imminent or already underway. Security Council action was blocked by the relatively principled objections of Russia and China, as well as Russia's selfish political interests in its relationship with Serbia. The OSCE, the most obvious regional actor, had neither the desire nor the legal authority to use force. A similar combination of legal and political constraints blocked action through the European Union or the Council of Europe. Unilateral action by the United States, however, was unacceptable to almost all states. Nonetheless, the United States, Britain, and many states of continental Western Europe were unwilling to stand by and allow genocide in Kosovo. Faced with a genuine dilemma, the members of NATO decided that intervention was the lesser of two evils. The leading powers were less than clear in their self-justifications, in large part, it seems to me, because of their reticence to appeal centrally to humanitarian concerns. The intervention, although unilateral, the technical legal sense that it was not authorized by the Security Council, has substantial endorsement and the participation by other Western powers, few of whom were concerned to support. A Russian resolution rejecting the NATO intervention was not vetoed but defeated by veto of 12-3. In other words, 4/5 of the Security Council opposed condemning the NATO action. As a liberal American whose political views were shaped during the Vietnam War, the writer admit to being more than a bit uncomfortable with this defense of the Kosovo intervention. This has been part of the problem in trying to marshal more effective action in Darfur. Perhaps, though, we are finally beginning to grapple with them, rather than leaving complete authority to sovereign states, even if they choose to exercise the authority by practicing genocide. Giving full weight to both the moral limitations of intervening only against genocide and the very real dangers of the partisan politics, this still seems to him as a small but significant step forward in international human rights. We can't forget Darfur when talking about humanitarian intervention. So now we're going to talk about Darfur and the future of humanitarian intervention. The above has largely focused on the transformation of norms and practices in the 1990s, culminating in the NATO intervention in Kosovo and the Australian intervention under the authority of the Security Council in East Timor. It, in effect, attempted to codify a right to humanitarian intervention against genocide and to argue for an even stronger principle, the responsibility to protect. Clearly, neither states nor the Security Council recognize any such responsibility. We have instead a right to humanitarian intervention that, like any right, it is exercised only at the discretion of the right holder. The right was soon put to the test in Darfur. In 2003, the largely Arab and Muslim government in Khartoum began to wage war against the largely non-Arab, non-Muslim population of Darfur, both directly through government-support militias. The parallels to Serbian ethnic cleansing in Bosnia and Kosovo are striking. A conscious effort seems to have been made both to limit the killing, which was aimed primarily at causing targeted populations to flee, and to engage diplomatically with critics in order to forestall an effective, full-scale multilateral intervention. Both the genocidal violence and the international constraints on its deserve emphasis. On the one hand, Sudan has been largely undeterred and unpunished. Although the violence has substantially moderated, a peace plan of sorts was agreed to in the summer of 2011, and relatively few new refugees are being created. Few of the displaced have returned home, and conditions remain generally dismal. On the other hand, there has been considerable regional and international action. In 2006, the Security Council authorized a peacekeeping force of more than 17,000. Charges were even brought against leaders behind the violence, including Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir. Given the savagery of Sudanese actions, over nearly half a century of internal conflict in the southern Sudan, it seems clear that international security and pressure moderated the violence. All of this, to be sure, was short for international response in Kosovo and this timer. The United States, when Darfur emerged in 2004 as an international issue, was already bogged down with wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. International responses to Darfur clearly treated Rwanda as a negative precedent. International action, although not particularly effective, was not insubstantial. Furthermore, the Sudanese government seemed to believe that they did not have the sort of free hand that they would have had just a decade earlier. One might even suggest that Khartoum engaged in a delicate balancing act to keep the number of direct deaths below what it calculated as the level that would provoke a more forceful international response. Success in Kosovo, and especially East Timor, created unrealistic exceptions among many. Therefore, has raised questions about the level of commitment. In particular, it has reminded us that relatively low costs of actions in Kosovo and East Timor were an important part of the calculus. Politics is still vital to the exercise of the right of humanitarian intervention. Genocide is the exception to the general rule that only means short of the threat or use the force can be used on behalf of internationally recognized human rights.